Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Fisdap Tips and Tricks webinar. Before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone that due to the volume of attendees, all lines have been muted. If you have any questions, please feel free to send them through the chat and we'll save some time to address them at the end of the webinar. Today's tips and tricks topic is Skills Tracker, Settings and Lab Practice Items. Our host is Ben Tate. Ben is a solutions consultant and has been with Fisdap since 2015. So without further delay, I'll pass it off to you, Ben.
Thanks, Haley. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning for those in Mountain or Pacific time. As Haley mentioned, we're going to get started with the tips and tricks on skills tracker settings and lab practice items. So I'm going to pull up here in Fisdap, and actually I started a little bit ahead of myself. Always like to start on the dashboard because it's a good way to just learn the different ways to jump off to where we're going, because when you get logged in, you're always coming into the dashboard. So with the skills tracker settings, there are actually two different places you can access them. One is from the skills tracker themselves. So if you hover over shifts and click skills and patient care, then to the upper right, you'll see the settings link here with a little gear icon, and you can click that, and that'll bring you to the skills tracker settings. The other location you can access it is actually from the account page, because we have all the settings linked together in a section on the account page if you have the program settings permission or edit program settings permission. So on the account page, you'll see the program settings box, program info. For those who were on the Appendix G webinar a couple weeks ago, that's where the Appendix G settings are located. You've also got your sites, your student groups, requirements, scheduler. Tashi talked about that in our last one. And then the skills tracker is where we will head to as well. And again, we'll see this is the same location that we got to from the skills tracker directly. So wherever you are in the system, whether it's in the skills tracker while you're working with a student, or if you are working on other skill or other settings rather on the account page, you can pretty quickly get to the skills tracker settings. So the first thing we're going to do here is just kind of talk about all these different settings. First, some of you may not have known this page was here, and for those that did, maybe you don't know what everything on here does, so we're just going to in brief talk about each of the options that are available. The very first option under the schedules section is going to be the students can create their own shifts for lab clinical field. This is actually not default. Default should be they can create their labs, but not clinicals or fields. So whatever you guys would like to set this to, this will allow the students to create their own shifts in the skills tracker, which if they're using the scheduler as well, will also show up in the scheduler as a student created quick add shift. These settings are actually linked to the scheduler settings for students creating their own shifts. So if I hit save right now as lab only, and then I head to the account page and then scheduler, we'll see that students cannot create their own field, cannot create their own clinical, but can create their own lab. So when we made the change in the skills tracker for that setting, it also changed in the scheduler. And vice versa, if I change those both to can and hit save, and then I come back to our skills tracker settings and hit refresh, you'll see now those three are all checked. So those two settings do talk to each other, because we don't want there to be a situation where students can create shifts in the skills tracker but not the scheduler, or vice versa. We want for that setting it to be the same on both ends. So I'm going to go ahead and set this back to the default, hit save, and just make sure that that takes. Next, students can mark themselves as either tardy, absent, or absent with permission. In the skills tracker, there are attendance options, and normally or however you set up the ability to do this will determine whether a student can make their own change or an instructor can. So an instructor always can come in, and if they have the edit field capabilities, as I'm in a field shift, they'll come into the shift, click on the little pencil icon there, and you can set whether the student was tardy, absent, or absent with permission, and you can leave a comment about it as well. So the settings we were just looking at will allow students to do that as well. So if you want students to be able to mark their own attendance, you can do that with these different options. If we were to set only tardy, when a student went to that shift, they would see only tardy as an option that they could set it to, not the absent or absent with permission. But again, even if the students can only do tardy, an instructor with that permission can still do the other options like absent or absent with permission. Those options do become important for hours tracking. For example, absent hours on a locked shift do not count towards their total hours goals for locked shifts. The next option are emails. And again, sorry, I don't have a default now, it's set to default. We do default warning students when documentation is late, and the default hours is 72 hours. This is actually 72 hours after the shift ends. So if the shift ends at 10 p.m., then the shift will be considered late 72 hours after the shift ends at 10 p.m. You can have these set independently. I know some programs don't want to have late data for labs. So while we can't fully turn off late for one, but have it on for the others, what some programs do will just as effectively put in 9999. So literally years later, it will be considered late. That way you can not have to worry about your students being inundated with emails about lab, but they will still be notified about the clinical and field. When the student gets the notification about it, it's simply an email at the 24 hours, or sorry, not at the time when it's locked, saying, hey, just effort. Sorry, it's not locked yet because we don't have that setting on. When it is late, they'll get an email from the Fisdap robot essentially saying, hey, your documentation is late, and that's the end of that on their end. On the students, rather on the instructor side in the shift list, and I'm going to come back here, and hopefully one of their shifts was late. Actually, both are fantastic. This red exclamation point is simply saying that the data was late. And as you can see here, in both instances, even when it's locked or unlocked, it is showing late when we hover over it. Again, in Fisdap, late doesn't explicitly do anything, but we're providing you the tools to say, okay, this was late, and you can set your own rules for what late data means, whether that's just warnings for your students, or if there's a grade aspect to it, or however you want to use that, the feature is there for you to use. If you did want to have a slightly more punitive measure when it comes to late data, we do have the option to lock the shift when the data is considered late. So at this point, instead of simply showing that exclamation point and emailing the student to say the shift is late, it actually locks the shift at the time when it's considered late, and the students will not have access to go and make any other changes unless the shift is unlocked by an instructor with the edit capabilities. In this instance, when you do have lock turned on, automatic lock turned on, the students will still be warned, and instead of getting the email when the shift is late, or in this case when the shift is locked, they actually get 24 hours in advance. So at 48 hours after the end of the shift, with how we have it set up right now, the students will get an email saying in 24 hours the shift will be considered late and it will be locked. So we do provide ample warning that it's coming up and that they need to make sure that they are completing their work before the late data hits, or else they will be locked out of the shift. As I'm sure many people know, that you can unlock a shift if you have the capability to do so. That would be, in this lab's case, the edit lab data permission. You can unlock a lab shift. If we were to do that, then this shift would not relock again unless it's manually locked. So the auto lock will auto lock the first time, but if a shift is unlocked manually by an instructor, then it will not re-auto lock. So anytime a shift is unlocked, if you guys do use the auto lock, you'll want to make sure that either yourself or the student will relock the shift when they have made whatever changes need to be made. While we're here, I'll just point out that there is well, it's going to yell at me that there's missing information, but here, we'll use this one as an example. There is a locked shift history. So in this case, it says it's never been locked. If I lock it, it will now show that it was locked by, well, this is confusing. The program I'm using is called Fisdap Robot, but it would normally only say Fisdap Robot if it was locked automatically. In this instance, I locked it manually, but as a account that's called Fisdap Robot. So I apologize about the confusion on that, but normally it'll say who locked it, and if it does say Fisdap Robot on your end, assuming none of your instructors have or your students are named Fisdap Robot, it'll only say Fisdap Robot if it was locked by the auto lock. So that's a way of knowing when it was locked. You can also tell it was locked by the auto lock because the auto lock query runs on the hour. So if it was locked on the hour, you sometimes, just through the nature of how long that query is, it'll be like 1502 or 1501 as the time it was locked. But that's a good indication as well that it was locked, part of the auto lock. The last option, coming back to the skills tracker settings of emails, is the send critical thinking prompts after interesting experiences. This is essentially a quick writing exercise that we email out if you have the setting turned on. If the students have specific patient impressions and complaints in combination. Essentially, if there's just sort of a strange or interesting case that the students worked on, we have a little prompt that they can be sent out. And if when they send it back, it gets sent out to the instructors as part of the student events email settings. So, and we'll just take a quick detour again to take a look at that. So on the accounts and then instructor account, essentially where you can edit your own, right now this Fisdap robot would not actually receive it because student events is turned off. So I would want to check that on if I wanted to receive those back from my students. And then as always, good to hit save. So that's the critical thinking prompts. Not required by any means. We do default it on, but absolutely can be turned off if you don't want your students to have to worry about those. Next section is going to be the graduation requirements section. And this is both setting the defaults for the graduation report parameters, and you're setting up the parameters for the widget itself. So right now you can see that locations is set to all types and all patient types. So if we were to go to the widget, which as an instructor, easiest way to do that is under the reports and then goals. The students will see their widget on their dashboard, but as an instructor, it's not something that you guys see, but the goals page will have the widget where you can select which student you want to look at. Right now, we're going to look at Fisdap Jack, and he's not done a whole lot. He has one observed team lead, it looks like, but other than that, it's not there. But what we actually want to look at is in the bottom left corner, the report is going to include all skills and assessments on all patients in the lab, clinical, and field settings. So again, that's what we're seeing. Those are schedule settings, don't need those anymore. That's what we're seeing here. So if we were to change this and say, let's not include the animal patients, and I hit save, and I come back to goals and hit refresh, we're now going to see it's just human and mannequin patients, not all patients in the lab, clinical, and field. So that sets the parameters for the widget, but it also will set the default parameters if we were to go and just run the report as normal. So if I come to the graduation requirements report, we'll see all location types, and then for patient type, human live, human dead, man sim, man other. And again, that's exactly what we had set right here. So this is where you can both change the widget and what the default parameters are for running the report. And the reason it changes both of those is because we do want it to be essentially, when you go to run the report, it should easily match what you already have for the widget. There's also a link to manage goal sets. So if you click that, it'll take you directly to the page where you could either edit a custom goal set. This program doesn't have one at the moment, or we could add one. And I'll quickly just go ahead and I need a title test. Oh, great. I've already done that in autofill. And then once I hit submit, you'll now see I could either edit it or delete it. Edit or delete there. And I actually will delete it. And yes, I want to delete it, and it is gone. So back to the skills tracker settings. Under documentation options, we do default the narrative to be on. You can turn off the narrative entirely, or you can manage what the narrative looks like. So our default is a large text box that says narrative, and actually we can hit the preview button and see what that looks like. So again, pretty standard. For those who haven't made any changes to it, this is what you would see when your students do that. Then we could make it medium or small. We can change the name of it. We can add new sections. So for example, I've seen some, didn't mean to do SOAP, S-O-A-P. So I've seen some programs that do either SOAP or OPQRST or sample as their different narratives. And so let's see what that would look like on the preview. So now we have 4 medium-sized boxes that each one is for a different location. So again, you can set it up however you'd like. You can delete them if you decide you don't want them, and then there is an undo if you decide you know actually we do want that back. Looks like I did not hit undo, but that's okay. And then the last option here is seed patient information. So what that means is if you have that turned on, it's going to pull the patient information from the first page of the PCR into the narrative automatically. So things like the demographic information, the impression, the complaints, whatever skills that they performed. And actually, if you hit the preview, it'll give you a little example of that. So you can see by seeding the patient information, this is what it pulls in. So it would be a patient with, a team of 3 members and so on and so forth. The other thing I'll point out is, like everywhere we have an open text box in Fisdap, we always remind students to not enter anything that would violate HIPAA. So we want to make sure they're doing that. Let's say after all that you decide, yeah, I don't want to do that, just hit cancel, and it won't save any of it. And there we go, it's back to the normal. Clinical and field quick add skills are an option that allows the students to enter skills in a clinical or field shift without fully entering a PCR. So for example, if they're in the emergency room and a doctor calls them over to push an IV, they didn't do the interview, they didn't do the exam, they don't have any of the patient information, but they did successfully push an IV, that's where quick add can come into play. And for those of you worried about Appendix G, on Table 2, Column 3, that is primarily the simplest way to get credit in Table 2, Column 3 is with quick add skills. So while we do allow programs to turn them off, I definitely recommend it for those trying to use Appendix G because it's very helpful for Table 2, Column 3. And then finally here, or not the finally, second to finally, is the auditing and sign off. First off, educators can audit shifts, defaults off, but if you turn that on, what that does is you can see right now in our shift list is just patients and attendance, but if I hit refresh, there's now an audited column. So there is a button now in the shift itself for audited. And if you've audited it, you simply check that. It'll need to be locked, so I'm going to have it lock it. And when I come back to our shift list, there's a checkbox there. So the auditing feature is mostly that. It's a way that you can just indicate in the system that you have audited it, so you can see at a glance that you've done that. There are a few reports like the hours report or the graduation requirements report that allow you to filter the data by audited, so you could look for just audited hours. So that's another place that the audit is used, but for the most part, it's mainly a tracking method in the shift list itself. And then preceptor sign off. So that is disabled to default, but again, we can turn that on and you can select either patient level or shift level. Patient level is going to be they have a sign off for each of their patients. Shift level would be one sign off for the shift as a whole. And then the options of how you do the sign off are down here. So we've talked in previous videos, but the circle buttons mean you can only check one. The square buttons mean you can check as many as you'd like. So this will give our preceptors more options of how they want to do the sign off, whether it's rate the student's performance, which is actually only used on patient level sign off. Recorded digital signature will be like signing your name on a credit card statement at the grocery store. Enter a Fisdap username and password if the preceptor or instructor has a Fisdap username and password in the system. So if they have an instructor account, essentially, they can use that. And finally, they can choose a file attachment. So let's say they're still doing actual work on paper, they could sign the paper, take a picture of that, and upload it as the sign off. Really quickly, I'll come back here and hit refresh to the shift list, because once we have preceptor sign off turned on, there's now a preceptor sign off column as well. So that'll be another link that can take you directly to that page. And finally, the shift evaluations. So in Fisdap, there are shift evals at the bottom of every shift, and we have an ability to require them. So if you click on the customize, you can actually see, you can select specific ones within each shift type to say, they need to do the site evaluation before they can lock the shift. So if they've not done that site evaluation, then when they go to lock the shift, they'll get a warning that says you cannot lock it until you do the site evaluation. So you would need to both select which one specifically you want, but then also just turn the setting on as a whole. And then conversely, if you want to turn it off, you can just undo it, or I like to make sure everything is unchecked just so there's no surprises if I ever turn it back on. The second page of skills tracker settings is called customization. So this page is all of the skills and interventions and meds that are available on our PCR to default. Everything is turned on when we started out, but you can come in here and any skills that your students shouldn't do or that you don't feel they need to have or anything like that, you can uncheck. So if you don't think they're ever going to do an autopsy, you can uncheck it, and that removes that option from the PCR. So it's both a way to clean up the list so there's fewer options for them to worry about, but also, especially if you're, say, an EMT program and a lot of these skills are directed more towards paramedic, you could remove any skills that they just absolutely shouldn't be doing, and that way they have a really clean PCR. This will also affect the quick add skills as well, not just the PCR. And then finally, in the upper corner are the lab skills themselves. So this section is going to be broken down by the EMT, AEMT, and paramedic because the group of lab skills will be different for each of them. There are the built-in categories. You can change the name of a category by clicking on, you'll see the option appears to make that change. Then you'll also see the various skills that are available by default for airway. For EMT, it's BVM and oxygen administration. You can, just to talk about these different options from left to right, you can show or hide. So if it's show, the students see it. If it's hide, the students do not. You can also change the name of the skill themselves by clicking that. Most of these will default to having a skill sheet attached, and you can tell a skill sheet is currently attached because of the little yellow check mark in the upper corner. But we can either remove that skill sheet, or we can simply change which one it is by coming in here and looking from the list. Then the skills box, I'm actually going to skip for just 1 second because that's sort of the big piece of it, and I want to end on that. The peer and instructor goals. So when a student does a lab skill, they will have the option of saying who is the evaluator and whether it was a peer fellow student or an instructor doing the sign-off or the evaluation for that. You guys can set your goals separately between the two. So you can say, in this case, we're defaulting to 5 peer and 1 instructor. So overall, the goal to 100% BVM will require at least 6 instances of them performing this skill, 5 of which being successful with peer, 1 of which being successful with the instructor. Again, you can set these numbers to whatever you like. We default most of them to 5 and 1. Some of them are a little bit different from that. And Eureka is a goal that, with the exception of IVs on paramedics, we actually default off to 0, 0. But if you want to not just make sure they're hitting a number goal, but they're actually consistently getting it, that's where Eureka can come into play. So, if you have them do 5 peer and 1 instructor, they could have actually done, 3 successful peers and then 10 unsuccessful peer evaluations and then 2 more successful peers. And technically they've met that 5 peer goal, but they had a bunch of failures in the middle of that. Eureka, to meet the Eureka goal, could alleviate that by saying, okay, not only do you have to hit your total peer and instructor goal, but you also need to say 5 of your last 5 be successful. So that way they're consistently doing it, or maybe 4 of their last 5. And once they've had 4 of their last 5 be successful, they would have hit their Eureka goal. And if they also have the 5 peer and 1 instructor, they would be at 100% for BVM. So again, it's a nice way to make sure your students are not just, brute forcing their way to getting all the numbers, but actually consistently, successfully doing these skills. So the last piece here, as I mentioned, sort of the strangest piece of it is the skills box. So at their core, lab practice items are effectively just a one-to-one to the lab goals. So in this case, when the student does the lab practice item called BVM, they get a goal of towards the peer instructor, depending who the evaluator was, for the goal of BVM ventilation. That is strictly for the lab skill to lab goal. But we wanted a way that allowed users who are using the graduation requirements report or the skills report, other reports that actually track the skills themselves, the ones that we saw on like the customization page, to get credit for that. So when a student does the BVM ventilation lab skill, they will get a manual ventilation credit. Now again, at its core with these default, that seems, that's pretty standard, but the reason we have this is because we allow for customization within these skills. So for example, if we rename this to CPR, we could have the skill be labeled CPR, but still give ventilation credit on the grad goal or the skills goal or the skills finder, or sorry, skills report or skills finder report. So again, it's up to you guys to how you want to customize this. One of the big keys that I see this being helpful with, especially, is I'm going to actually move to paramedic for this, is under airway for paramedic. Many of the airway skills default to giving airway management credit. So for those programs that want to be able to give airway management credit outside of always just using a patient, this is a way that that can be done. So when a student does the direct oral tracheal intubation adult lab skill, they're both going to get the credit for the peer or instructor, but they're also going to get credit for the other reports for everything in this box here. So in this case, airway management, endotracheal suctioning, manned ventilation, oral tracheal intubation, capnography, capnometry, and pulse oximetry. Now, not all of those are tracked on the grad report. All of those are tracked on the skills report because the skills report does show everything. But again, you guys can set this up how you'd like. You can turn anything off, you can change the name, you can change the credit, and finally, you can also click on the plus practice item to add a completely new one to that category. I would recommend using this with caution, and the reason I say that is because once a lab practice item is added, it cannot be removed. It can be hidden, of course, and the students won't ever see it, but anyone who has access to this page will be able to see those ones. So if you accidentally click it, it's not a huge deal, just hide it, and the next time you need a skill under that category, you can use that one, edit it, and work from there. But all things considered, I tend to recommend only clicking it if you definitely want to add a skill to that option. The last thing I will say before opening up to questions, which again, I apologize for going a little long on this, but for those who can continue to stay, if we do have questions, that would be fantastic. But the last thing I will say is that while you guys as the users will not have the ability to add additional categories, we as staff do. So if you find that you need another category in any of your cert levels, the EMT, AEMT, or paramedic, we can add that in. So for example, if you wanted your EMT list to have the same categories as paramedic, right now there's only 4 for EMT and there's 7 for paramedic, we could add those extra categories in, and you could then populate them with your custom skills that you would like. So if that's something you're interested in, just go ahead and email support@fisdap.net, let them know, hey, we'd like 3 additional categories in EMT, or however many you'd like, and just specify the number of categories and which cert level, and we can make that happen. And then you'll be able to just edit them and get them all taken care of. So with that, I will pass it over to questions, assuming there are some, but I think I see there is. Let me see if we can open this up. Nope, that's not it. That's the chat. Maybe not. I just see Tashi.
I can read it to you, Ben.
Thank you. I'm struggling to find it.
No problem. We do have one question that came in. It says, Ben mentioned the critical thinking prompts. What are the types of experiences that trigger this?
I do not have the list off the top of my head, but let me see if we can gather that offline, and we can. Hey, we have a list of the people on this webinar. Is that right?
We do, yes. So that
okay, perfect.
From Chris Parker. So Chris, we can email you that information once the webinar's done.
Fantastic. Yeah. Sorry, they don't have that ready to go, but there are a number of things that'll give that credit, and we just want to make sure to tell you the right thing. Any other questions that anyone might have?
We did just get one more in from Courtney Pesney. How do I document an isolated skill versus skill done in scenario?
Great question. So the skill done in scenario, and so this is for those who aren't aware, this I believe specifically referring to the Appendix G and specifically Table 2 and the different columns. The scenario is going to be column 2, or the blue column, and that will be entering a patient in lab that is any patient type other than human live and marked as formative. So actually, let's just take a look at that since we've got a lab right here. So I'm going to come and I'm going to click on this patient here. So The formative versus summative is the first option. That's something that we've newly added with the Appendix G, and it will default to formative. So most of the sections, if they care about formative versus summative, most of the sections do want formative. So if they forget to change it, odds are they're on the right one. It'll default to the right one. The only place that uses summative will be column 4 of table 2, but everyone else uses formative if they care at all about formative versus summative. So otherwise, we just need to make sure that it's a non-human live patient, which at the moment it is. So if we were to change this to mannequin sim and then fill it out as we expect for the row that we're trying to get credit for, let's say we were doing direct oral tracheal intubation adult, you would fill out the required information and then you would come and do the orotracheal intubation and save that and make sure it's a locked shift because everything on Appendix G does need to be locked. So for table 2, column 2, the blue column, the scenario column, that is again a non-human live patient in lab with formative checked. For the individual skill, which would be column 3, or the isolated skills, for column 3, the green column, that is using a live patient in lab, clinical, or field. So we would want human live if we were in lab. And then the skill that you're trying to get credit for can be the only skill on that patient. So hence the isolated portion of it. So if we said we did this and we give it an age and the complaints don't matter nor the impressions with the third column, but if we then said the only skill performed on this patient is oral tracheal intubation adults, and one attempt I performed yes, and save, this would count as the isolated skill. So it's a little bit strange to fill out the patient or to have the PCR with only one skill, which is again going back to the quick add skills. Why, if possible, that is actually a really good way to get credit in column 3, the isolated skill, because inherently the quick add skills are isolated skills because they're not. They will be an individual skill, not linked to a patient with other skills. Any other questions?
Yeah, Ben, we have a couple more. If we turn on the signature requirement, does it lock automatically, and where do they sign or put in a password?
Great question. So yes, it will still lock. So the preceptor sign-off, apologize for not going in more depth on this. The preceptor sign-off is not something that is going to be explicitly required. It's another place, kind of like the lock in general, sorry, the late in general. If you don't have lock on, it will provide you guys with the tools to make sure that they're being signed off on, but we will not necessarily enforce it or anything like that through Fisdap specifically. So in this case, if we come back to, we have patient level sign off turned on. So it's saying 0 out of 1 because there's one patient on it. So we're expecting to see 1, but none of them have been done. So we can do 2 options. One is we can actually click on this. That's if it's shift level. I apologize. What we want to do is go into the shift and into the patient, or we can either click here or we'll see it in the patient. I'll actually do, well, no, I won't do both because it's not gonna let me. I'll go right to here from the preceptor sign off. And so this is what the preceptor sign off page looks like with all those features we had turned on. So there will always be the shift summary. This section is the rate the student's performance. So if you don't have that turned on, this section will not be here. But with the rate the student's performance, it'll have both the student rate themselves and then the preceptor also give a rating. The plan of action will always show up, and then the actual sign-off options are the other options. So we've got the username and password, the digital signature, and the attachment if you want to use the attachment. And the other option that's very nice when doing the sign-off itself is you can individually lock the patient for that student. So if you are doing patient level sign off, you can make it so that patient that they just worked on is locked and they can't continue to edit it, but they can continue to edit the shift as a whole. So they can add additional patients and then get those signed off and so on and so forth. So if we were to go ahead and I'll do a digital signature, sure, we can put test, and it's a little unwieldy on a mouse, but if you're using your fingertips on a tablet or a phone, which this absolutely works on, it's a great way to do it. And I'm actually going to lock it, and we'll hit yes. Oh, I did not do it. Okay. Well, let's say the student was great on everything. Again, if you have rate the student's performance on, it will have you actually make sure to do it. So now we'll go ahead and do the sign off. And we can see both there's a lock on that patient and the check mark is there now. And if we head back to the shift list, it should say 1 of 1. And actually, when it's completed, it completely goes to that icon. And just to quickly show what it would look like if you had shift level, it'll be mostly the same, but instead, now if we go back to our shift list, you'll see instead of it saying 0 to 1, we just have that icon of the person and if they're missing. So I'll go ahead and check that. And as I said, even though we have rate the student's performance on, it's a patient level only. So when we're doing shift level, that doesn't appear. So we just have the shift summary, plan of action, and then how we want to do the attachment or the sign off. So I could do that and I can lock it. And using my own, and I'm not in my own program. Fisdap. All right, there we go. And there we have it, and the sign off. I think Haley said there was another question as well.
Hey, Ben. Yep, we do have one more question.
No problem.
For team leader and team member entries, do you only use that to get credit for Appendix G, page 3 requirements, or do they also count towards skills in scenario?
With the team leader, yes, to the short answer, it counts both for the option for table 3 where it does care about team leader versus team member, but we do have other places that will track whether they're team lead or not. It may not be as strict as table 3, but for example, if we go to the grad report, and actually I'm just gonna pull up still have it open here. I'm just going to go to the widget since it'll be easier since the student has nothing anyway. But you'll see on the grad report and the widget, there is a team lead section. And so if you open that up, this one's actually just looking at team lead total. Usually there are more options. So let's actually go back to the grad report, and I'm going to just open up the goal set because the goal set will let us see what it looks at. So under team lead, the section, there are actually a few different specific things that it tracks. Unconscious, so everything under the team lead section will require them to be team lead and the additional options looking at. So in this case, it would be an unconscious patient while also team lead, a pediatric patient while team lead. Team lead total is just team lead total, and then ALS would be an ALS patient, again, while also team lead. So we do have other sections that will look at team lead. They're not necessarily required by COE the way Appendix G is, but it is an important thing to indicate for other instances, if they are team lead. If they aren't team lead in the situation, they don't need to worry about it. They can just, enter the rest of the PCR as they need. But if they were team lead, or if it's a scenario and they're acting as team lead, it is best to make sure that gets selected. And while we're on the goal set page here, I will point out that part of a goal set, whether you're using the default one or if you use a custom one, is what gives credit for team lead beyond just clicking the I was the team lead box. So in this case, a patient or student will get credit for if she perform the interview and exam. So both of those are checked. So if a student marks themselves as team lead but did not mark the interview and the exam, with this goal set, they would not get credit for that team lead.
All right, well, that's all the questions that we have. So thank you, Ben, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. We hope to have you join us for the next Tips and Tricks webinars on September 4th and 18th. To stay up to date on all of the upcoming webinars or to see recordings of previous webinars, you can visit the link there, go.fisdap.net/tips and tricks. There'll be a brief survey after the webinar, so please be sure to let us know your thoughts on today's webinar and if you have any suggestions for future topics. If you have any additional questions that weren't addressed today, please feel free to submit them there as well. Thank you, and we will see everyone next time.
Thanks. Have a great day, guys.